All square.
All right. Starting with audience participation. I assume most of the people here are using CSS in their day-to-day work. How many people here use something like can I use to figure out what CSS you can use for the browser set that you're concerned with, right? So many, many of you. How many people here know how can I use figures out what you can use in which browser for the various web platform features that you want? Fewer hands. They have test cases. And these test cases, you have to have a way of knowing how to write a test case for a particular feature in a browser. These test cases refer back to specifications. In CSS, it's CSS specifications. How many people here have read a CSS specification? All right, a few more. My condolences to all of you. And those CSS specifications, how many people here know where they come from? Fewer. All right, so there is a CSS Working Group that's part of the W3C whose responsibility is to maintain and edit these specifications to tell the browsers how they are supposed to implement the CSS features that you see and can I use and use in your work. So that's just some basic introduction for my talk that I'm going to be referring back to. So I work at Adobe Systems, and I have worked on typographic and layout systems for about as long as the web has existed, but I did very little with the web for a very long time, mainly because the web for a very long time was not very typographically interesting. That's changing, has changed, and I became involved in the web starting around in 2011, so relatively recently. When I was asked to give an internal talk at Adobe on what the web still lacked in the way of typographic and layout features. So I gave a talk about things like baselines of text and being able to line things up to baselines, whether it's for a drop cap or with a baseline grid. And I talked about shapes, being able to wrap content around something other than a rectangle. You know, the content here wrapping around the side of the vase here. And this talk, I went through a few other things as well. This talk was fairly well received. It was a bunch of people who were interested in the web at Adobe and interested in contributing to browsers. What I didn't realize at the time was that this whole thing was a trap. I was approached after my talk by a guy that I had met just that morning who happened to be our representative at the W3C who said, yeah, great talk. You're going to join the CSS Working Group and you're going to get all of this stuff done. And so I did. Join the working group, at least. Some of the things I've gotten done. Shapes is now in 2 browser engines and is in development in a 3rd. Other things I have had less success with. But I think my successes have slightly been more than the failures. And just last year, the W3C appointed me co-chair of the CSS Working Group. So I now control the future of CSS. Actually, I'm just the guy who makes sure that somebody's taking notes when the group meets, that we're doing all the things that we need to do to make sure that the browsers can implement the things that we're writing down in the CSS specifications. And I'm there to make sure that everybody's voices are heard when we deliberate over what should be changed in CSS, what should be added to CSS. And it's really that reason that I took on the job. The CSS Working Group has a lot of browser developers in it, which it needs to. It's a good thing, because they have to implement the things that we're talking about, we have to have some feedback from them on whether something is implementable or not. But they're not the only ones who have good ideas on what should be added to CSS. The people who use the technology and the people who want to use the technology but can't because it doesn't have the features that they need also have great ideas that should be added to CSS. So I'm there as the co-chair of the working group to make sure that people outside the browsers, people like you who use the technology, have a way of influencing the future and direction of CSS. So my getting up in front of you today is really to ask for your help in doing my job as co-chair. And there are 3 things that I'm going to talk about that you all can do to help me figure out what the future of CSS is going to be. So the first one is to just talk about what you're doing. Talk about the problems that you're facing. Tell people about the solutions that you found. Write blog posts, tweet about things, get up on stage and talk. Go to a meetup and give a lightning talk on the things that you're doing on a day-to-day basis. It's great to get the discussion of what people are trying to do with CSS out in the open. You also gain by clarifying your thoughts to the point of publishing or talking about them, and you make connections in the community that can really benefit you. When I first started with the web platform, web fonts were just taking off, which were really great things. But I would see all sorts of web font problems on websites where somebody would include a single regular font face in their web font and then go use it in a headline. And the browser, not knowing how to turn this single face font bold, would just go smear the glyphs around to make it look a little darker. And so I'd see these sites and kind of shudder and want to do something about it. And to begin with, my strategy was to find some contact information. You know, the old school webmaster email link, or maybe a Twitter handle, and get a hold of the people to say, hey, you got a problem on your site, here's how you could fix it. The Bootstrap site was one of the sites that I ran into, and I let them know. And every site that I ran into that had this problem, I would contact them and let them know. The Bootstrap people were great. They fixed it within a week. Other people I didn't hear back from. I just kept on finding more and more of these things, and my awesome solution for fixing the web really just didn't scale. So instead, I wrote an article about the problem and published it. It got a much wider reach, and I hope it had a much greater effect on the web than my poking at individual people did. But there was something that happened with this article that I didn't really expect. The article is, here's a problem. You should include all the fonts that you need in your web fonts. But if your web font doesn't have them, here's a workaround for being able to use a web font in a headline without letting the browser go and smear it around on you. And one of the very first comments that I got on the article was somebody who had seen exactly the same problem, had written an article that I had missed about a year earlier, and they had a better solution than the one I had come up with. So just the fact of me communicating about the problem that I saw and the solution that I found, I was gifted with a superior solution that I wouldn't have otherwise been able to find. And I hear this all the time from people who get up and speak, from people who write articles. The back and forth that you get, it's not just, here is my knowledge. It's making connections with people who are interested in reading what it is you're putting out or listening to what it is you're putting out and giving you feedback, giving you more information than you had to begin with. 2 people in particular have been incredibly helpful to CSS specifications just by publishing what it is they're working on. Sarah Sweden, who was mentioned earlier today, had a very large influence on the CSS shape specification, which I added, because she was there experimenting with it and publishing her experiments and showing us where the syntax wasn't the best and how to improve it. Rachel Andrew is another web developer who has written a lot about CSS Grid and has made substantial contributions to improving the specification, making it easier to use. The CSS Working Group does read almost everything. All of us combined read almost everything about what is being written about CSS. So getting the word out, giving a talk is a great way to let us know what problems people are trying to solve, the solutions that are working or not for people, and lets us prioritize what it is we're going to be doing. And when Rachel and Sarah and I started working with the CSS Working Group, all of it was being done on a gigantic email list that you had to subscribe to and read a fire hose of information every day, and it's kind of difficult to see what threads of discussion have gone before and all this. So one of the things I've been trying to do is make contributions to the CSS Working Group and CSS specifications easier. So just 3 months ago, we decided that we were going to move all of the specification discussion to our GitHub repository. We already had a repository, we just weren't using the issues. So now, anytime someone needs to make a change to a CSS specification, it's an issue in the repository. And they're tagged with the specification that the issue is concerned with. And getting a change to CSS can be as easy as opening up a GitHub issue. Or putting your 2 cents in is just finding the thread discussing something that needs to be changed and getting a comment in. So this is like the very first step in trying to make things easier. Hopefully will smooth the way even more. So please talk about what you're doing. Let us know in the CSS Working Group so that we can more closely hew to web developers' actual needs. The second thing, oh, I forgot about this. So not just CSS, there are also ways to contribute to the entire web platform. There's a discourse-style forum on the Web Incubator community group. So if there's you can raise CSS issues here as well, but also HTML and SVG and JavaScript, anything that the W3C is involved with. There's this great interface here. I recommend that you check it out. So the second thing that I'd like you all to do is shout when things go wrong. How many people here have encountered a browser incompatibility that you've either had to work around or just stop doing what you're doing because it just isn't going to work in the browser set? And of those people that are raising their hands, how many people have written a browser bug for the browser that's doing it wrong? Maybe 10%. Everybody should be writing more browser bugs. And they're trying to make it easier as well. Recently, the Edge team, or at least a couple people on the Edge team, decided that they'll take bug reports through Twitter. Give them a set of steps, put the hashtag in, and that's probably the easiest way to report a browser bug. But each browser engine has their own bug repository, and you can let them know when they're doing things wrong. We used to run a set of events called Test the Web Forward. There were a couple in Seattle and a few in other places around the world. And we built this website to house a whole bunch of information that people needed to know about testing cross browsers, about reporting bugs in the browser. So we have a page here that says, here's the place to go to report a bug for any browser that we had at the time. It probably needs to be updated for things like Brave and Vivaldi. And one of the best ways of writing a browser bug is to give them a cross-platform, cross-browser test case that they can use to reproduce the problem and see what they're doing wrong. And so on this Test the Web Forward site, there's also the section on writing tests that shows you how to write a W3C style test case. We have a few different formats that we use at the W3C that are meant to run in all of the browsers. And over the past 3 years or so, we've been making an effort to make sure that all of the browser engines can run these tests in their own test harnesses. So you can write one test for the browser bug that you report. That test can be folded into a W3C test suite. The test suite gets taken up by all the browser engines, and your test case will be run continuously in every browser engine for perpetuity to make sure that the problem that you encountered, once it gets fixed, never gets a regression. So like I said, we used to run these events. It's been a while since we've run one. But if you're like me and are more interested in writing test code than production code, I am perfectly happy to give anyone here individual instruction on how to write a W3C test, how to log a browser bug. Talk to me here, get a hold of me on Twitter. Testing is something that I am most concerned with. That's one of the things that we could do the most better in the working group, is to come up with better test suites for the CSS specifications. And it's something that I think we need a lot of help with. So I'm hoping some of you here can be the people to help us with it. So the last thing, I assume, since a lot of you here are staying for all 3 days of CascadiaFest, that there are people here who use JavaScript as well as CSS, maybe even a bit more JavaScript than CSS in your day-to-day work. There is a task force of the CSS Working Group called Houdini. And Houdini was an escape artist. He escaped out of boxes, so the name is apt in that way since CSS has a lot of boxes. But Houdini was also an enthusiastic debunker of charlatans. He loved going to the people who claimed that they could speak with the dead and pull back the curtain and show the trick that these people were performing on their marks. And CSS has a lot of magic. You have some markup and some styling, and it all goes into the black box of a browser, and you get layout on the other side. And what happens in that black box isn't terribly well described. And you certainly can't go in and see how it all works, and you definitely can't go and tweak just a little bit of it to make it do something else that might be more interesting to you. My team at Adobe spent a lot of time writing a bunch of polyfills for the features that we were working on, like CSS shapes and drop caps. And we found that it's really just way too hard. There's so much of that black box in the browser that you have to replicate in JavaScript code to read the styles and parse the declarations and fiddle with layout. And it's particularly galling when you know that your code that is parsing the CSS style sheet is running probably just a little bit before or a little bit after the browser code that is doing exactly the same thing. And you're just trying to reverse engineer something in this black box that you don't have any access to. So Houdini is trying to open up the black box and make things tweakable. A few of the things that we're working on are the second version of custom properties that let you do things like validate the value that you're passing into a particular custom property, say whether it's inheritable or not. Just some things that we had to leave out of the first declarative-only version of custom properties. We're also working on a typed object model. So instead of just strings, you can actually get some objects where you have some idea of what these components of a CSS value are. Letting you have hooks so your JavaScript can do some custom paint or custom layout. And one of the things I'm involved directly in is giving you font metrics to let you answer questions in script like, where is my baseline on the page? Or what fonts are actually being used on the page by my actual content? Things that you have no way of knowing at the moment. So just as a short example, this is a bit of the typed OM where you have a background position value where the current object model just gives you a string, center, bottom, 10 pixels. And if you want to go modify the 10 pixels bit, you have to have some string parsing to go figure out where that length value is and what units it's using and strip off the units and increment the 10 and then put the units back on and then put it in the right place in the string and send the string back. There was a Google Polymer project that was doing just a tiny bit of custom layout. And they did some profiling on their code and found that 40% of the time, 40% of their code execution was just parsing strings in their CSS. So hopefully, something like this, where you get a background position value that has components, like a length. The center is actually just a 50% length. The bottom 10 pixels is a length that happens to be a calc. We give you back a calc object that has itself a couple components that you can drill into and find the 10 pixel value. The 10 pixel value isn't a string, it's a length that knows it's in pixels. And perhaps you can just add 5 to it and send it back through. And all of the parsing that gets you to those objects and gets you back to the value can be handled by the browser. And your code can just do the little fiddling that it needs to do without having to reinvent everything in the browser. So if you like JavaScript, if you've ever tried to do custom layout of your own in JavaScript and run into problems in the CSS object model, or just in hooking into browser layout, I would encourage you to take a look at yet another GitHub repository for the Houdini drafts, where we're discussing what needs to be exposed, what affordances we need to add. I'm certain there are things that we're doing wrong, so please go take a look and tell us where they are. So, call to action. You can help me out. Help me make the future of CSS by communicating what you're doing, shouting when things go wrong, and let us script our way towards better styling. Thank you.